שלום לכולם. לעונג הוא לי להיות כאן בנוכחות כל כך הרבה אנשים חשובים. שמי אריה רייך, אני פרופסור בפקולטה למשפטים ומשמש גם כסגן הרקטור של האוניברסיטה. So this is a bilingual conference. So also this session is going to be bilingual, and I will also speak half in English and half in the holy language. We have two speakers delivering their presentation in English and one in Hebrew. Our subject is education and leadership. Anyone who can lift up the volume, I'll be happy, but usually I'm told I have a very strong voice, so you should be able to hear. Otherwise, try to adjust your hearing aids. So our subject is education and leadership, which is a subject very appropriate in a conference devoted to the memory of Rabbi Sachs. His legacy was one of both education and leadership. He was a great leader, religious and moral leader of the Jewish community, of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, with a great influence way beyond the border of the Commonwealth, and he was also a great educator. His moral voice was heard not only within the Jewish community, but also among the Gentiles, where he became a spokesman for the Jewish people, spreading the moral and religious messages of Judaism to all peoples of the world. אני אעבור לעברית, ואני רוצה לומר משהו קצר על מנהיגות. ואני חושב שאין כמו בפרשה שקראנו בשבת האחרונה כדי לבטא את מה שהתורה חושבת שנדרש ממנהיג. התורה מספרת על משה, שגדל בבית פרעה כמו נסיך, כן? כמו נסיך מצרים, כמו שספילברג קרא לו בסרט המפורסם, ומה שהיינו מצפים ממנו, אילו הוא היה דואג לאינטרסים של עצמו, הוא להישאר נאמן לארמון, לפרעה, לבת פרעה, ולברוח מכל חיבור וקישור לעם העבדים, לעם המדוכא והמושפל שם בחוץ, אבל לא כך בוחר משה. כתוב, ויהי בימים ההם ויגדל משה ויצא אל אחיו וירא בסבלותם. הוא יוצא אל אחיו. הוא קודם כל, יש פה הכרה בכך שהוא מבין שהוא אח שלהם והם אחים שלו, והראייה הזאת בסבלותם זה לא רק ראייה פיזית, זה ראייה נפשית. הוא לוקח אל ליבו את מה שהוא רואה. והביטוי הזה של וירא מופיע גם לגבי השם. בסוף אותו פרק, כשהשם שומע את זעקת בני ישראל, רואה את סבלותם ושומע את זעקתם. זה ראייה שלוקחת ללב. ואחר כך וירא איש מצרי מכה איש עברי מאחיו, ויפן כה וכה וירא כי אין איש ויך את המצרי ואת מנה בחול. אנחנו רואים פה אדם שלא מוכן לעמוד מול עוול. הוא לא מוכן לראות את החזק שמשפיל ומכה את החלש, והוא מיד קם ועושה מעשה. הוא לא נשאר על הקווים. יכול היה אדם לומר, טוב, אבל אולי זה מין מוסריות מוגבלת כזאת שבעצם יודעת להגן על בני עמו מפני תקיפות של בני עמים אחרים. כדי להפריך את התפיסה הזאת ממשיך הסיפור ומספר, ויהי ביום השני והנה שני אנשים עברים ניצים, ויאמר לרשע למה תכה רעך. משה מיד מזהה, גם כאשר העוול נעשה בתוך עמו, הוא מיד מזהה. לא רק יש לו אמפתיה לסבל של בני עמו, יש לו גם חוש צדק מפותח, והוא מיד מזהה מיהו הרשע ומיהו הצדיק. ויאמר מי שמך לאיש שר ושופט אלינו? על אורגן אתה אומר כאשר הרגת את המצרי. מה אומר המכה? הוא אומר, it's not your business. It's not your business. למה אתה מתערב בעניינים לא שלך? משה, שהוא המנהיג העתידי, it is his business. הוא לא מוכן לעמוד בצד כשנעשה עוול. זו תכונה חשובה של מנהיג שלא נכנס לפינה שלו ולא אכפת לו מה שנעשה בחוץ, הוא אכפת לו מה שנעשה, יש לו אמפתיה לחלש, למדוכא, ויש לו חוש צדק מפותח. ושוב יכול הטוען לומר, טוב, אבל זה עדיין בתוך עמו, אבל כשיראה שני זרים שאינם מבני עמו, זה כבר אולי שם הוא כן יפעיל את אותה דוקטרינה, so it's not your business. וממשיך הסיפור לגבי הרועים שמגרשים את הרועות, את בנות יתרו, ומשה קם ומושיע אותם מהרועים. כן? פמיניסט הראשון אולי בהיסטוריה. הוא לא מוכן לראות את הדיכוי של החלש בידי החזק. ובהמשך, הסיפור, עוד תכונה חשובה שאנחנו לומדים, כמה תכונות חשובות אנחנו לומדים בפרקים הבאים על משה. קודם כל הוא רואה את הסנה בוער, והוא שואל למה לא יבער הסנה. יש פה תכונה שהיא מאוד מאוד חשובה לנו פה באקדמיה, יש פה סקרנות. למה לא יבער הסנה? איך יכול להיות שהסנה איננו עוקל? הסקרנות הזאת היא זו שמניעה את כולנו כאן, החוקרים, באוניברסיטת בר אילן, באוניברסיטות אחרות, אנחנו מנסים להבין מה קורה, וזה גם תכונה חשובה של המנהיג, לפני שהוא מקבל החלטות, שינסה להבין מה קורה ולחקור ולהגיע לחקר האמת. וכמובן, הענווה שלו, שלח נא ביד תשלח, הוא בכלל לא רוצה להיות מנהיג, הוא לא רואה את עצמו כמנהיג, הוא כבד פה וכבד לשון, אבל הקדוש ברוך הוא יודע יותר טוב, הוא יודע שיש בו את תכונות המנהיגות, ולמרות שנבואתו לא קם כמשה, לא הייתה כנבואה כזאת, עדיין, והאיש משה ענב מכל אדם אשר על פני האדמה, יש פה את הענווה האדירה הזאת, וגם התכונה הזאת, זו תכונה שגם הרב זקס בספר שלו, Lessons in Leadership, מציין שזו תכונה שעוברת כחוט השני בין כל המנהיגים, שהתנ"ך בוחר אותם, כן? החל משאול, המלך הראשון, שהוא נחבא אל הכלים, ודוד, שהוא האח הכי צעיר במשפחה, ובכלל שמואל, מכל הבנים שהוא רואה הוא לא חושב בכלל שהוא בכלל מועמד, וכן הלאה וכן הלאה, וגם על הציווי על משה, שלא ירבה לאנשים ולא ירבה. אם כן, יש פה מסרים חשובים בנושא של מנהיגות בפרשה. הרב זק, כמו שציינתי, כתב על זה ספר שלם. נדמה לי שהספר הזה עדיין לא תורגם לעברית, אם אני לא טועה, אבל בוודאי הוא תורגם בקרוב. אז אני מזמין את המרצה הראשון שלנו, נכון? זה רפי, אתה הראשון? אני אציג אותך. Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum is Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies, which is previously was the Jews College, and he is the Rabbi Sacks Chair of Modern Jewish Thought, which was established by the Zandan family. He's also a disciple of Rabbi Sacks. He lectures in Jewish education, new readings of classical text, as well as training teachers, educators, and rabbis. He's got a rabbinic ordination from the Montefiore Kollel, and he also has the kind of degree that you expect from any rabbi, a PhD in theoretical physics from King's College London. He's got an MA in adult education from the University College of London. He's a graduate of the Mandel School in Jerusalem, also Mandel School of Leadership, I think it's called. He regularly writes articles for the Jewish press and essays for journals and book collection. He's traveled the globe lecturing at many diverse institutions. Please, Rafi. Floor is yours.
I miss my teacher. And 2 years and 2 months after his passing, the greatest nachama, the greatest comfort, is that this room is full of people who loved his thoughts and his humanity. And we're together to learn and discuss and analyze his work. And that's a great nachama and a great pleasure to be here for that. And I thank all who have organized to allow that to happen. What is modern orthodoxy? What's modern about it and what's orthodox? Today, culturally, it implies progressive attitudes to 4 things most people talk about university, the role of women in Judaism, the state of Israel, and non-Jews. And over the last years, we've seen different formulations of what these things mean. Torah Derech Eretz from Rav Hirsch in the 19th century, Torah Umada from Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb in the 20th century at YU, and Rabbi Sacks himself in his formulation of Torah and Chokhmah, which he describes in his book Future Tense and his discussion of inclusivism. But Rabbi Sacks wasn't a fan of talking about these things, of defining modern orthodoxy. When I was going to organize a conference about it, he said, "Don't." He said instead, show them how we learn. And they'll understand through that. So I don't want to discuss what it is now. I want to analyze an origin. How far back does it go? Jews in a cultural, a communal sense, or together, not individually, being involved in and being trained in subjects outside of Judaism. I'm going to give an early example and how Rabbi Sacks thought about it and how it might help us think about him. and it's a work in process, so critique away. There were always individuals who were very engaged outside. Philo in the 1st century, Rabbi Nasi, the Gemara talks about him, talking to Chachmei Atuna, knowing about Greek language and thought, and of course the Rambam, 12th century Maimonides. But those were individuals who learnt on their own. What about people who collectively did it? So that, I understand. There were a few examples earlier, and I was talking to Alan Brill yesterday. There were certain small groups of Gaonim who were familiar with Islamic thought, and so on. But the origin, and this began from a conversation I had with Josh Berman a long time ago. Thank you for that, Josh. It's when Jews started going to university. And that is in Italy in the 15th century. Why? Political competition of different universities, something you're probably unaware of here in Bar Ilan. But Padua wanted to compete, and so they let Jews in to train as doctors. And so for the first time, you have groups of Jews learning subject outside in Latin, and it therefore relating to their Judaism. And there's a wonderful book that describes this, which I'm going to quote from now, Cultural Intermediaries by Ruderman, which talks about this, and you've got the quote here in source 1. Of particular importance is the number of rabbis who also trained as doctors in Italy from the late 16th century onwards, particularly after the medical school in Padua, and later other medical schools begin to accept Jewish students in large numbers with growing regularity, shaping a kind of informal fraternity. So what does that do when they're involved in that general sense? That's the background to what I want to talk about. I want to focus on chapter 6 of Rabbi Sacks's book, The Great Partnership, about religion and science. And in that chapter, his introduction is what I want to focus on, where he talks about a particular scholar from that time, from 15th century, whose name was Pico della Mirandola. Not Jewish, was going to train to be a priest, but didn't in the end. Very famous for, known as the writing of what was called the Manifesto of the Renaissance. At 23 years old, to accompany his 900 theses or definitions of what all the challenges are for modern knowledge, he wrote a book called The Oration of the Dignity of Man, where he describes what this new view of the knowledge that they had and its relevance to all society was. And I'm going to read for you over here. And the way it's a brilliant booklet, you can get a hold of it. And in it, he talks about, he imagines what God says to humanity, to the first man. And it's the following here. He says, "We give you, O Adam, no visage proper to yourself, nor any endowment properly your own, in order that whatever place, whatever form, whatever gifts you may, with premeditation select, these same you may have and possess through your own knowledge and decision." This is very radical from being based on tradition of the past and working things out and knowing it for yourself. "The nature of all other creatures is defined and restricted within laws which we have laid down, we being God. You, by contrast, impeded by no restrictions, made by your own free will to whose custody we've assigned you, trace for yourself the lineaments of your own nature. I've placed you at the very center of the world." So a very different conception of humankind in this way, as autonomous and powerful to determine what they want to be with no bounds at all. Very dramatic statement. "So from that vantage point you may with greater ease glance around about on all the world contains. We have made you a creature neither of heaven or of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, in order that you may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. It will be in your power to descend to the lower, brutish forms of life, and you'll be able, through your own decisions, to rise to the superior orders." No one ever did a better description of this modern humanism than Piccolo de Mirandola in this quote over here. And Rabbi Sacks brings it in full in this chapter, and he describes it below, as you can see, as to appreciate that the Renaissance began as a religious humanism. The Italian Renaissance was in part the rediscovery of Christian Europe of the classical tradition, as we know. But what he noticed in Pico's words was a very particular religious humanism, not what you might have expected from a Christian. For what they express is the standard Jewish reading of the creation of the first humans. There's no reference to original sin and the fall of man. And by Sacks highlights this seems much more a Jewish reading, which is a human being in the image and likeness of God with incredible power and freedom to be creative. So Sacks asks in the last paragraph, how did Pico arrive at this interpretation? previously excluded from Christian theology as the Pelagian heresy. So we know the idea of original sin comes in with strengthened version of Thomas Aquinas in the 4th century. But after that, there were other Christian views that challenged that and said, actually, it's not the idea. Original sin being that not just eating from the tree made you mortal, from Adam and Eve eating from the tree makes a person mortal, and so they swallowed, therefore, not just that Adam and Eve are mortal, but all humans after are mortal. But in the same way, the sin they swallow with the apple, and therefore sin is in every person born from then on. And that idea was discussed in Christian thought. And Pico doesn't bring that at all. And Rabbi Sachs argues it's a much more of a Jewish view. And how does he know that? It's well known. Because almost certainly it was a result of his encounter in Padua with a Jewish scholar called Rabbi Elijah del Medigo, who taught him Hebrew and Aramaic, introduced him to Babylonian Talmud and classical Jewish Bible commentaries, and even gave him tuition in Kabbalah and mysticism. Now, that might seem surprising to you, and it wasn't standard. But we know historically there was a huge overlap of what was going on. If you turn over, there's a just brief brushstroke outline of Jews in the Renaissance, especially in Italy, especially in Florence, because Cosimo de' Medici, a successful businessman who pretty much owned Florence, allowed Jews in for financial and other reasons, and with them came Jewish wisdom, Hebrew, Talmud, and Kabbalah. And it was a very fruitful interchange of ideas in this kind of very cosmopolitan society, unlike Rome itself, which was a bit more frum. It was. So he created a kind of Neoplatonic academy under his patronage, and Donatello, Botticelli, all these amazing painters and artists gathered together there and were supported by him. And Florence became the center of the Renaissance. At that time, back in Rome, the Pope wants to develop and build the main chapel there. It's renamed after him, Sixtus Sistine Chapel. And even though, as I said, Rome is very different to Florence, the best painters and artists are in Florence. So they bring them all over in order to develop it. As you can see over here, I don't want to go into it too much. Just to know, as you know, Michelangelo studies under Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. So even though Michelangelo himself doesn't learn from Jews, his teachers were very influenced by Jews, and it becomes amazing that the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel does not contain apostles, does not contain anything from Christianity, but has only got Hebrew Bible, Tanakh figures on the entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which many have noted is because of his humanistic ideas and universal, not just being Christian, but a kind of unification of Judaism and Christianity in some ways. And as we mentioned, although Pico de Mirandola learnt from Elijah del Medigo and Alamino and other Jews as well. And then later on, while Michelangelo is working on the Sistine Chapel, Raphael, great name, Raffaello is working on the Raphael rooms and the famous painting of the School of Athens. And you've got a picture of it over here very briefly. Rabbi Sachs actually does refer to this painting in one of the faith lectures, but that's something separate. But just what's interesting about this painting is these are all classic philosophers, in this one, and he doesn't know what they look like. He doesn't know what Aristotle looked like. So what face do you give them? So many analyses of these paintings say that he's got the classical character, Aristotle, then he might have a more modern version of that person, and then even a contemporary who is of that ilk, and therefore the face is the face of the modern person representing the previous older philosopher. So if you look over here in the bottom left of the painting, there's one guy with a turban. And if you look at the top right, the second, I've enlarged it a bit, and if you go down again, I've enlarged it even more, leaning over. Who's the dark guy with the turban? So many argue that it's Averroes, Ibn Rashid, who was an Arabic philosopher and whose works were translated into Latin and Hebrew, and through that partly reawakened the Western European interest in Aristotle and the Greeks. That's how it came in. But the face, again, Averroes wasn't around at this point. Now, he was 12th century. This is 300 years later. So it's Averroes historically, but the face, some say, is Rabbi Elijah del Medigo. So it makes it even possibly him. Possibly, suggestion. right? But it's the same idea because they needed a face of now and they wouldn't have known what Averos looked like either. But you see this incredible interplay of what's going on here. So this is interesting for me. There are other examples of it, but you have Jews mixing for the first time in university, learning systematically the language of the academia, which is Latin, knowing about these issues, being surrounded by fascinating new ideas, the Renaissance coming in. And for me, this is the birth of whatever kind of modern author, whatever you want, traditional Judaism, but involved with the world. And I find it interesting to think about that and about Rabbi Sachs, especially if you go on to page 3, because this is an amazing book, by the way. Ruderman talks about 10 different cultural intermediaries. He's got a whole chapter on Del Medigo talking about this issue. So, the top left, the quote here talks about, just the bold, the emergence of the Jewish scholar who sees his role secondarily in some cases or primarily as the teacher of Christians. They become the intermediary of explaining ideas. It's a secondary role, even a primary role, something which was endlessly debated in Anglo Jewry about our chief Rabbi Sachs at the time. But to point out, as Rabbi Sachs does on source 6 over here, is the oration is a turning point, and as he mentioned earlier, doesn't mention original sin and is much more Jewishly described. And the quote at the bottom, Pico understood that one of the driving themes of the Hebrew Bible is that it's precisely in our freedom that the human person most resembles God. A very different formulation than we've heard in the past. Now, what are the Jewish sources that we guess Del Medigo taught Pico de Mirandola? And Rabbi Sachs quotes it at the beginning of his chapter from Psalm 8. Ma enosh kitis grenum o ben adam kitif gedenu. What is man that you are mindful of him, or son of man that you even visit him? Because what are you? And this is not the image of God pasuk we always quote. This is more powerful in some ways. Vatachasrehu ma'at me Elohim. Or is it me Elokim? It's not clear from the commentaries. Because you have made him, God, you have made man a little lower than God or lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. It's an amazing verse. Humans are almost God or almost angels. The Gemara in source 8 brings that verse in the conversation where God at Mount Sinai wants to just give the Torah to the Jewish people and the angels don't want to give it to a human being. Right? Who is man that you'll give it to him? And God responds and says, no, I want to do this. So it becomes that source. If you turn over on source 9, another one that quotes that verse from the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah, Chamishim sha'arei bina nivru ba'olam, v'chulam nitnu leMoshe chasei echad. 50 levels of knowledge. If he had 50, he'd have the knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God. One less. So in this version, it's ma'at me Elohim, one less than God. That's an incredible humanist central view of the power of what a human being can do. Source 11 is just the fact that Mirandola in his oration actually directly quotes that he gets many of the ideas from Kabbalah and talks about Kabbalah. You could read it for yourselves. In source 12, I want to analyze this aspect of original sin. Because if you read the Torah very carefully, the first mention of sin is with Cain and Hevel. There is no mention of sin in the story of Adam and Eve eating from the tree. There's no punishment, there's consequences. So it's interesting that's the case. But now I want to show you, in the last few minutes that I have, is cross-cultural things going on. Because even though there's no mention of it in the Torah, the Rashi already, you can see that in the source over here, talks about chata, the sin that happened earlier. How come Rashi is now calling it a sin? And I went through the Talmud and the Midrash to see how often is the word chet used for Adam and Eve eating from the tree. And I would like to suggest it might be partly the influence of the Christian idea of original sin, of that sin going into the person and being fundamental. And so it's uneven. In the earlier sources, like the Talmud in 13, when it's talking about the 12 stages of the creation of Adam, the 10th is he stank. When he eats from the tree, it's like sarach. It's dirty, it's bad. But in the Midrash, you can see in verse 14, which is a bit later, it says avah, he transgresses. And you can see in 15, 16, and 17, and 18, all different sources from the Gemara and Midrash are discussing where it talks about possible original sin. The best source for it, which Christians use, is source 17, a pasuk actually in Tehillim again. Hen ba'avan chalaltu v'chet yechematani yimi. Behold, I've shaped you in iniquity, and in my sin my mother conceived me, which was used often for original sin. But if you look at all the Jewish commentaries, none of them go down that path. They all explain it's particular to that person and do it in that way. But there is an element of it in Russia and other places. So when you interact with another culture, it's always going to work both ways. There's influence on both sides. Did some ideas of original sin make it into Judaism? And did Jewish ideas of this power of humanity and not being pulled down be pushed into Christianity? Rav Soloveitchik makes the point about how Judaism is different. And from a Jewish point of view, we don't believe in original sin. But I want to end. I want to begin to end. The end of the beginning.
Like Churchill.
Yes, exactly. Good note there. We've quoted the famous pasuk about how we're almost like gods. But I don't pray that psalm every morning. That's not what's in the davening. It's part of the Psalms, and it's read on certain Yom Tovim and stuff. But if you look at the beginning of the brachot of the morning, it's a very different conception. What do we have to do? And Rav Sachs in the Siddur calls this section Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. This is source 20. It's found in the 10th century Tanna Devei Eliyahu, and the second paragraph you'll recognize from the Yom Kippur Ne'ilah. But it's quite a late text in a way, and it's a very different conception of what we are. And this is what we say every morning. Ribon Kol Amim, Lord of all worlds. Ma'anu, what are we? What are our lives? What's our kindness, our righteousness? What's our deliverance? What's our strength? What's our might? What can we say before you? Are not all the mighty like nothing before you? It's the very opposite view. We're not almost God, we're practically nothing. Famous men as if they'd never been. The wise as if they know nothing. And the understanding as if they lack intelligence. For most of their actions are a waste. It's a very different conception of a human, which I daven this morning, and what I say. We make that paragraph, then we say, Aval anachnu amcha b'nei britcha, but only because we are your people, Israel, God, can we even respond. And we say, therefore, as a result, we are obliged to pray to you. And we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And therefore, we declare our commitment to the kingdom of heaven. A very different conception. So Rabbi Sachs has correctly quoted verses and shown the connection of the religious humanism of the Renaissance, absolutely. But as we know much later with the Renaissance, that the religious part goes, and we get radical humanism and rejection of religion, and leading to the new atheists and what the book is all about in the modern times. And that seems to be, interestingly, the fact that it takes that humanistic side, but takes the religion out of it. What's interesting is the other side of religion with this humility or respect, which comes in source 20, which we're bound to do at the same time. And what I would end by saying is, Rabbi Sachs's book says, the great partnership of God and science and the search for meaning. But I would suggest when you read the book that it's much more about the partnership between this ma'at and this ol. This we're almost like gods as humans. And Rabbi Sachs is very humanistic in his power of the individual and what you can achieve and what you are about. It's incredibly individualistic, his books, To Heal a Fractured World, which seems very unreligious in some ways when you read them. But the way he does it is by balancing it always with this ol, with this responsibility. The reason we feel so powerful and ability to do things is because we are almost like God. And that's why it's in the echad of the Shema that we say every morning that those two ideas are balanced. The ol and the ma'at, almost like God. So I want to introduce that idea of why Rabbi Sachs, therefore, I could very happily call a Renaissance rabbi. Thank you very much.